Good morning, everyone. Well, some of you have been here since a bit earlier, so okay. Welcome to our first keynote lecture by Professor Peter Boxall. I just offer a few words, and then I'll pass you over to Peter. Peter is a Goldsmiths Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford, you know, and a Fellow of the British Academy. He's a leading scholar of 20th and 21st century literature, although his work does roam further back than that as well. He's written several enormously impactful books, including but not limited to 21st Century Fiction, 2013, The Value of the Novel, 2015, The Prosthetic Imagination, 2020, which was the winner of the MLA James Russell Lowell Prize, which was described by one reviewer as a rich and exhilarating and ambitious theory of the novel. The Prosthetic Imagination offers a fascinating focus on the novel form, in part because of what Peter sees as the novel's special access to interiority. And I quote from the book, the closer the novel comes to the inner recesses of mind, the more intimate its address to that hidden place where language establishes the binding of mind to biological matter. The persuasive connection, I think, between interiority and the body is a key part of the argument. It runs right through the whole book. But also for me, the mapping of this feature, this quality, back through the ages in literature is particularly fascinating. This is not a new invention, I think is the implication. More recently, in 2024, The Possibility of Literature was published, which is a collection of essays that Peter's written over the last 20 years. And it ranges very widely, covers subjects from beauty to being, to the idea of a tradition, to, I suppose, an attempt to grapple with the meaning of the contemporary, all such ideas. But running through, I think, the essays, as I see it anyway, is a series of questions which relate to the value, the function, the possibility of literature, as the title suggests, but also the idea that, I suppose, the question of whether or not literature simply responds or reacts to the world, or it shapes it imaginatively through imaginative and philosophical power. And I think this is a sort of consistent idea, I suppose. And I suspect some of this will probably emerge today as well. Aside from his research, Peter is also the editor of the book series, Cambridge Studies in 21st Century Literature and Culture. He's also the editor of the major journal in sort of contemporary and 20th century writing, Textual Practice. So I think the engagement and the commitment to literary studies is very wide-ranging, particularly important, I think, at a time when the humanities is under siege in so many places. So I think that the attempt to sort of try to say and try to demonstrate the value of literature and the possibility for literature is immense throughout the work. So with that said, Peter's keynote lecture today is entitled Intermediality and the Value of Beauty, Henry James's Ground. So please join me in welcoming Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me if I just talk at this volume at the back? There's a genre of introduction that is so immaculate and accurate and praising that what follows will always feel like an anticlimax. And I'm afraid that Neil has just demonstrated that genre. Thank you, Neil. That was a remarkably illuminating for me account of what my work tries to do, and what I'm doing today will fit exactly in the mold of what Neil has just laid out. To start with some thanks, thank Neil for this invitation. This is the second time I've been to Singapore and to NTU, and both times have been totally revelatory. So thank you for the invitation. And people were saying last night that this is the best organized conference they've ever been to. So the team should take a bow wherever you are. And also the range of papers here looks totally scintillating and focused on this question of reconfiguration and the intermedial. So what I have to say today, along the lines that Neil has just laid out, we'll be trying to think about how intermediality in some specific ways and some broader ways might help us think about how literature reconfigures. And what I have to say will be in 4 parts, so you know where you are, and if you want to have a little snooze at any point, to go ahead. And I'll speak for about 45, 50 minutes. And I'm going to be talking today on intermediality and the value of beauty, Henry James's ground. And I'm going to be thinking about intermediality today as it relates to that perennially difficult question of aesthetic value, as Neil's introduction would suggest. How does the experience of intermediality, broadly defined, relate to the political purchase and value of the artwork, of what the artwork is able to do in the world, the kind of possibility it's able to invent? This, as I say, is a perennially difficult question, but it is one which seems particularly difficult in our own times. And in everything I have to say here, the word our and the word we is in question. And so how far what I have to say resonates with this international audience is something that I'd like us maybe to try and approach in the Q&A. The nature of this difficulty, the sense that the perennially difficult has become the specifically difficult, was suggested to me very recently, in fact, earlier this summer, when the theorist and literary critic Homi Bhabha came to Oxford, where I teach, to give a series of lectures on contemporary migrancy and its relationship to literature. At the center of these lectures that Homi gave was the concept for him of standing. Standing as in standing for, asserting what it means to stand for something. Standing to as putting your body in a public space as an act of protest, a question which for US academics this summer was particularly live in relation to Columbia and Harvard and elsewhere. To take a political stance or position, Bhabha said, is intrinsically to stand. And we may think of Greta Thunberg being bundled into, well, being arrested very recently. At the end of this lecture that Bhabha gave, Bhabha took some questions from the audience, a very packed audience here to see a celebrity academic. A young man in the crowd asked him, how does he square the message of the lecture, this angry young man asked, that one must stand, with what this angry questioner saw as the complicity of universities such as Oxford or Harvard, where Bhabha has a professorship, with repressive or genocidal governments. When students are facing arrest and deportation for protesting against Israel's actions in Gaza, how, this questioner asked, can the university be a place where one can take a stand? Shouldn't Bhabha simply leave the lecture hall and get out onto the street and protest there rather than talk to us in these cloistered halls? Bhabha's response to this question seemed to the student questioner to be unsatisfactory. You have to know, Bhabha said to the young man, when to take a stand and when not to. It's better, he said, to reap the advantages of a university education and use that education to offer what he called a sustained critique of state power than to throw away that advantage by getting kicked out of college for civil disobedience. Bhabha could tell, I think, as we could all in the audience, that this answer did not satisfy his questioner. Barber asked at the end of the session, he was in very good humor. It was a very funny occasion, but he asked at the end of the session, who here thinks I'm a sellout? Massive hundreds of people. One person's put up their hand. Who thinks I'm a sellout? And the angry questioner and a scattering of others most emphatically raised their hand, as this woman did here. But even in its unsatisfactoriness, this answer threw a certain amount of light on a question that has become pressing for us today. How this questioner was asking Barber, are we to turn in our time to the archive, to the canon, to the literary and aesthetic tradition, and to find in that tradition a ground from which to critique the condition of our politics, a condition, what is more, and this is key to the whole decolonizing the curriculum movement, a condition that our political condition today, that is arguably a result of that very tradition. How does poetry, how does the experience of aesthetic beauty more broadly have a meaning for us when the currency in which cultural capital is realized has been arguably radically devalued? When the university starts to resemble a weak arm of the state, how does a critique of state power express itself? What does such a desire for refusal have to do with philosophy or with poetry? Barber's response, that standing against the corruption of democracy that we are witnessing in the US and the UK and Europe and elsewhere, should involve us keeping at least one foot and perhaps both feet inside the institution so that we can claim for ourselves some of its authorizing power. This response seemed to some in the lecture theatre unsatisfactory. Indeed, it seemed somewhat unsatisfactory, I think, to Barber himself, even if he made a winningly honest attempt to square theoretical commitment with real political pragmatism. But it led me to feel that it's incumbent upon us now to think afresh about how we, and what I mean by we here is at stake, how we value aesthetic beauty now, about how we understand and map out the ground upon which our aesthetic judgments are based, the ground upon which, to use Barber's terms, our conception of a literary politics is required to stand. To think now about the value of beauty requires us to approach this ground upon which we stand. It requires us to return to the possibility of judgment as understood by Immanuel Kant. It's a key difficulty for Kant that although beauty is a judgment, so beauty does not reside in the beautiful object, but in our appreciation of it, aesthetic judgment has power and validity only insofar as it makes claims to objectivity, as it summons to existence what Kant calls a sensus communae. If someone considers, we're in section 1, by the way, if someone considers the building we're looking at, the clothing someone is wearing, the concert that we have heard, the poem that is presented for judging, if someone considers any of those things to be beautiful for Kant, this judgment requires others to share in it. For, Kant says, and this is the first quote on the screen, for he must not call it beautiful if it pleases merely him. If, Kant goes on, he pronounces that something is beautiful, then he expects the very same satisfaction of others. He judges not merely for himself, but for everyone, and speaks of beauty as if it were a property of things. I think a mistake that we routinely make, that we think the beauty resides in the object rather than our appreciation of it. The contemporary moment requires us to return to this ground, this shared space that the judgment of the experience of beauty makes available. It requires us too to return to Heidegger, who I assume was in Barber's mind when he enjoined us to take a stand, as standing is a key Heideggerian term. It's the central question that faces us when we try to grasp being, Heidegger writes, to ask what ground we stand on. This is the broadest question, Heidegger writes, and also the deepest. Why are there beings at all? Why, that is, what is the ground? From what ground do beings come? On what ground do beings stand? To grasp our being is to know what it is to stand. To know, he says, means to be able to stand in the truth, to stand in the openness of beings, to stand up to it. Section 2. What ground do we stand on when we stand before the beautiful object? And how does this ground make politics possible? This is the question I'm going to try to approach here. And I'm going to do this today by perhaps counterintuitive means. Henry James and Henry James's ground, whose work I will be discussing in this lecture, may not be an obvious witness to call when discussing how we might refashion the relation between aesthetics and politics under contemporary conditions. James might strike us as a writer who tends towards the hermetically sealed, who presents us with artworks which, in their high polish, their exquisite intricacy, you never hear of Henry James without someone using the word exquisite, I found. Their works in their high polish and their exquisite intricacy tend towards the abstracted or the self-referring. The golden bowl as a Jamesian object is this enclosed thing which allows no way in. His highly polished prose offers an unblemished surface, a kind of shiny surface, whose very beauty seems to proof it against any contact with the world beyond the artwork. But if this is so, I'll suggest today that James's fiction is centrally concerned, it's its main concern, I think, it's centrally concerned not with the work of art as abstraction, as art for art's sake, but with the extraordinarily fragile and difficult ground that the artwork shares with the world. It is not only a central question, but the central question, the broadest and deepest question in his work. What ground do we stand on when we approach an artwork? What kind of jurisdiction, and this word jurisdiction is central to everything I'm going to be thinking about today, what kind of jurisdiction does this ground come under? The jurisdiction of the artwork or the jurisdiction of the world? When we approach that artwork, the ground we're standing on, does it belong to the artwork or does it belong to the world? How can we tell the difference between these zones of influence? How does what we commonly call life situate itself in this struggle for jurisdiction between artwork and world? How is the question of the purpose of the artwork determined by this struggle for jurisdiction? How, in other words, does Jamesian love of beauty or Jamesian beauty itself, and we may attend to the difference between those things, how does Jamesian beauty yield an ethics or a politics? This question can be found running like filigree through all his major novels, where it's associated with the Heideggerian question of standing, of what Heidegger calls standing before. It's also a question that is indissociable from the question of the intermedial, the question that we're addressing in this conference over the next 2 days, the intermedial as it relates to the possibility of reconfiguring. Intermediality itself as offering a very particular kind of ground. The most insistently recurring form that this standing before in James takes is the scenario in which a fictional character stands before a painted portrait and finds in this approach, from the fiction to the painting, both a revelation of the conditions of being and an encounter with a certain kind of non-being that is an element for James of all aesthetic experience. And I'll try and be as clear as I can about how that relation between being and non-being in James works. we could think about any novel that James has written in this regard, but we might, for the sake of argument, take as an exemplary instance of such standing before the moment in The Wings of the Dove when Milly Teale stands before Bronzino's portrait of Lucrezia. And experiences in her recognition of an uncanny resemblance between her own self and this painted figure, at once an extension of being, a materialization of being, and a loss or erasure of that same being. I don't know whether people remember in the Wings of the Dove, it's a key moment where Milly is in a grand house and they're going up looking at some paintings. She sees this painting and has a kind of powerful life-changing experience when she realizes she and the painting are identical with one another and enter into some mutually productive relationship with one another. The resemblance that Milly feels between herself and Lucrezia leads her to an identification with the image that is also a weird kind of substitution. It was as if, Milly thinks, Milly had been the Bronzino and the Bronzino only Milly. Very strange sentence, I think. Art becoming life, becoming art, and what we make with that only is key. The lady in question, the narrator says, with her slightly Michelangelesque squareness, her eyes of other days, her full lips, her long neck, her recorded jewels, her brocaded and wasted reds, was a very great personage, only unaccompanied by a joy, and she was dead, dead, dead. I mean, it's striking how James's descriptions of paintings so often find themselves borne out when you look at the painting itself. Here and throughout James's novels, the moment that character and painted figure feel this bond with each other is a moment that confirms being, that externalizes fictional being, so we find out what Milly looks like. But such confirmation is finely woven, always in James, into the intuition that the meeting ground between life and art that this intermedial moment allows is composed not of augmented life, but of death. It's in looking at Lucrezia that Milly, for the first time, understands in an abstracted way that she is dying of an unspecified terminal illness. And Milly's death that's sort of lying latent within her is the element around which the whole novel turns, and in fact is the wings of the dove of the title. Her death is the wings of the dove. Milly approaches here her own death as the medium in which the novel truly happens, the deathly medium in which the various relations that the novel plays out, and in which the novel's thinking comes to possibility, unfolds. When Milly approaches the Bronzino, she stands on that very ground that Heidegger stakes out in Being and Time, enacting the standing before in which death, in Heidegger's terms, becomes a possibility of being. With death, Heidegger writes, Dasein stands before itself in its own most potentiality for being. If Dasein stands before itself as this possibility, it has been fully assigned to its inmost potentiality for being. So this death as possibility, death as potentiality for being is at stake in James's imagining of standing before. This standing before, in which a relation between character and artwork opens a kind of deathly non-being, which is also the basis for being, for what James calls throughout his oeuvre life. And what James means by life we could talk about for many years. This standing before is everywhere in evidence in James's novels. But to try to come close to the ground that it makes available, the ground upon which I'm suggesting that we might found a kind of aesthetic judgment that can help us think about the value of beauty today, I'm going to train our eyes, our collective eyes, on a clutch of shorter works by James. These are the tales and novellas constituting a body of work in their own right that focus with intense and very delicious wit on the intermedial, on the effects that arise when an artwork contains within itself a critical encounter with another mode of art or another mode of thought. So I'm thinking about intermedial not just as fiction meeting art, but fiction meeting philosophy, fiction meeting thought. This group of texts, probably many of us will already have some of them in our minds. This group of texts very often stage this encounter as one between fiction and painting. We might think of his short fiction Glasses, which hardly anyone talks about, but it's an absolute jewel in his crown, if I can use that awful cliche. We might think of this tale Glasses, a tale in which a painter is obsessed by a beautiful woman named Flora Saunt. Flora is astonishingly beautiful, and her beauty becomes confused throughout the story, as it often does in these stories by James, with the painter's capacity to capture that beauty in his paintings. And so its location and absolutely crucially the use to which Flora might put her beauty becomes strangely removed from itself, strangely marooned between art and life. Flora's beauty, as is often the case, is concentrated in her beautiful eyes, whose form the painter tries again and again and again, like Cézanne and his mountain, to capture in his painting. He does it so well, in fact, that a man falls in love with Flora and marries her, having not seen her, having only seen the eyes that the painter manages to paint so well. But the story's tragedy turns around Flora's deteriorating eyesight, which she refuses to correct by wearing the glasses of the title, as these, she fears, would mar her beauty. She wants to snag a husband, and at one scene she has to kind of hide away and put glasses on to see something, and the husband's coming, the potential husband. She has to whip the glasses off, in case she looks ugly wearing glasses. So the eyes which the painter reproduces, and which those who admire his painting love to look upon, cannot themselves see. They can't fulfill their major task. Those wonderful eyes, we learn, are good for nothing but to roll about like sugar balls, which they greatly resemble, in a child's mouth. She can't use them. Or we might think of the brilliant little tale, The Real Thing, which is much better known, in which another Jamesian painter encounters a very perplexing and highly comic difficulty when an aristocratic couple, down on their luck, offer their services to him as paid models. They kind of arrive in his studio full of grandeur because they're aristocrats who have fallen on hard times. They offer to sit for a series of illustrations for money that the painter is making for a complete works of one of the great writers of our day. And the painter thinks to himself, perhaps it will be interesting to draw aristocratic personages, which he's used to doing, not from models who aren't themselves aristocrats, but from actual gentlefolk. He can draw his people for once, he thinks, from models who are the real thing of the title. But the twist of the story lies in the discovery that, in fact, the real thing doesn't suit the artist's purpose at all, and that for a model to serve, they have to be susceptible of artifice, made only loosely and partially of reality. The artist says in a brilliant comic little line, he said, it was amusing to do Major Monarch's trousers, but in the end, Major Monarch is just too real. I mean, so you can't fit into the painting that the illustrator is trying to capture. The painter had, he realized, as a result of his dealings with the monarchs, the aristocrats, an innate preference for the represented subject over the real one. The defect of the real one was so apt to be a lack of representation. I liked things that appeared. Then one was sure. Whether they were or not was a subordinate and almost always a pointless question. These painter stories open a kind of intermedial terrain that is generated by painting on the one hand and by prose on the other, but whose specific gravity and quality is determined by its belonging properly to neither to painting nor to fiction. And The Real Thing is brilliant at just putting us in that zone. That non-jurisdictional zone. And affiliated with these painter stories, part of the same experiment in literary thinking, are James's famous writer-reader stories, stories whose intermediality rests not between the verbal and the visual, but between different categories of thought, between literature and philosophy, between fiction and criticism, a zone which many of us live in day to day. We might think of The Figure in the Carpet, maybe his most famous novella, in which the great novelist Vereker accidentally insults a literary critic who has written an admiring review of his latest novel. People remember the scenario: the critic has gone for dinner and he's going to meet the great novelist who has just written a review of. The novelist doesn't know the critic is at the table. Vereker, the novelist, is asked during that dinner party what he thought of the review that's written by the critic who's sitting there without his knowledge. You know, a terrible scenario. And not knowing that the critic is a fellow guest at the dinner table, Vereker answers that the review is, quote, the usual twaddle. The critic is, of course, mortified. The usual twaddle, he thinks to himself, my acute little study. But Vereker himself, the novelist, is also equally mortified when he learns that he's insulted the critic so rudely, and he's insulted this critic and, what's more, this admirer. And so Vereker calls the critic to his bedroom after dinner in order to apologize and, in some sense, to pay recompense. And so there's this incredibly intimate scene that's at the heart of James's oeuvre in some ways, a homoerotic scene between the novelist and the critic, who are both talking about how the artwork works, where it comes from. As an act of reparation, Vereker decides to reveal to the critic that there is a secret threaded through his art, an exquisite scheme, he calls it, that nobody, not even his most acute critic, has ever been able to see. And as they stand before each other by the fire in Vereker's room in this intense, erotic encounter, the meeting between reader and writer approaches that ground that we see in The Wings of the Dove, that ground that lies at the vanishing foundation of aesthetic experience. The reader implores the author to reveal to him how his art works, to tell him what the secret that animates his work is. He sounds very foolish when we hear him say this. Is it some kind of game you're up to with your style? Something about some sort of philosophy? Some idea about life? Is it some game you're up to with your style, something you're after in the language? Perhaps it's a preference for the letter P. The critic wants the novelist to render his art in the language of criticism. That's the intermediality at work here. But Vereker himself, of course, wants to render criticism as art, as fiction. Can't you give a fellow a clue, the critic demands, and Vereker's reply insists that the clue is there before us, is the work of art that we are reading. My whole lucid effort gives him the clue, Vereker says. Every page and line and letter, the things as concrete there as a bird in a cage, a bait on a hook, a piece of cheese in a mousetrap. It's stuck into every line as your foot is stuck in your shoe. It governs every line. It chooses every word. It dots every I. It places every comma. Section 3 of 4. The writer-reader stories all approach this ground that opens when reader meets with writer, a ground that's exposed to in the writer-painter stories. But the work that I'll focus on for the rest of this lecture, the Aspern Papers, is compelling for my purposes and for our purposes in this conference because it brings together the relation between reader and writer with the relation between fiction and painting in a way that approaches the intermedial ground I'm staking out here, the ground that comes to thought when the artwork excavates the place from which it draws its own possibility. And I'll try and kind of unravel that rather dense thought as I go. This is a ground to being that is not housed in any of our given apparatuses for being, that does not belong either inside or outside any given rhetoric or paradigm or institution or lecture hall, if we remember that conversation between Barber and the angry questioner with which I started. This is a ground to being that's not inside any of those institutions, but which offers itself as a kind of naked life, a life so shorn, so unadulterated, that it feels indistinguishable from death, as Millie finds when she looks at the Bronzino. The Aspern Papers, and I don't know how many of us have the Aspern Papers in our minds, but it doesn't matter if we don't, because I'll try and fill it in as I go. The Aspern Papers tells the story of an unnamed critic who learns that there is a body of lost papers, by the great poet, fictional poet, Geoffrey Aspern, which belonged to Aspern's ex-lover and one-time muse, Miss Juliana Bordereau. In an attempt to get his hands on these papers, the critic, who's also preparing an edition of Aspern's work, travels to a beautifully, gloriously described Jamesian Venice, where Miss Juliana Bordereau lives with her niece, Miss Tita Bordereau, in a vast, crumbling but gorgeously described palazzo. Juliana Bordereau, an ancient, secretive and reclusive woman, guards the Aspern Papers with a tigerish ferocity and has repelled all attempts by previous critics to gain any access to them. It's the kind of frustrating thing for Aspern studies in James's text. So when the critic protagonist travels to Venice, his aim is to trick his way into Miss Bordereau's confidence, and thus to the papers, by presenting himself as a lodger to Miss Bordereau and to her niece, Miss Tita Bordereau, who is a younger woman, unmarried, also advanced in years. The critic, we have to imagine, is a kind of young buck, and both Tita Bordereau and Juliana Bordereau are outside his zone of interest in terms of age. This is significant when we come to it. The critic has an insatiable hunger for the Aspern Papers that goes well beyond that of a diligent researcher, and is instead some kind of aesthetic ontological craving, a desperate need to gain a physical proximity to the hidden place from which art is born into the world, the place that we're thinking about today. This obsession with Aspern's art leads the critic to regard the two women not as people in their own right, but as odd external remnants of the artwork, either conduits to the secret recesses of Aspern's art or obstacles to it, and whether they're one or the other is key to the plot. Both the women and the Venetian setting of the tale are depicted with a characteristic Jamesian vividness, but even as we're presented with this technicolor rendition of faded Venetian grandeur, we see it not quite in itself, but as the critic sees it, as a fading after effect of the great poet's presence, a kind of testimony to an aesthetic, poetic spirit animated by Aspern, which is now departed. As the critic is introduced into the striking, and once you've read the story, you never forget it, the striking presence of the older Miss Bordereau in a back room in her grand palazzo, a large shabby parlor with a fine old painted ceiling. It's not the woman before him that he sees, the strange figure sitting alone at one of the windows, but the woman as the poet saw her. They come back to me now, the narrator says, almost with the palpitation they caused, the successive feelings that accompanied my consciousness that, as the door of the room closed behind me, I was really face to face with the Juliana of some of Aspern's most exquisite, there's that word again, and most renowned lyrics. To look at her, he thinks, is to look into a pair of eyes into which his had looked. To touch her is to touch an aged hand that his had touched. Everything that happens in the Aspern Papers takes place across the fault line that we can trace here as the young critic stands before the elderly muse, the threshold across which Aspern's poetry, preserved in the elusive papers, meets with the world that he left behind in its aging, post-aesthetic strangeness. In seeking to cross this threshold, to pass from the present world of Juliana Bordereau's Venice, which the critic visits, to the hidden, lost world of Aspern's poetry, the critic is willing to pay what he calls an exorbitant price. He agrees to the old lady's outrageous demand that he pay rent of 1,000 francs a month, which is at least 10 times the going rate. He also finds himself to pay the younger Miss Bordereau, Miss Tita Bordereau, in a different and alarming kind of coin when he considers marrying her in return for the papers. It's the novella's central concern, a key element of its anatomy of aesthetic political economy, to measure this price, to dwell on the difficult junction between the artwork and its crude monetary value, with which a devotee of art should traditionally have nothing to do. It distressed him, he says, it distressed him to find that for these women so associated with Aspern, the pecuniary question should so constantly come back. All Juliana's interested in is making money from this guy. His maneuvering to gain access to the papers, both financial and sexual maneuvering, he acknowledges, had, and this is a key line for me, had made me gross. The term that James uses throughout his oeuvre for the unbeautified realities of life under capital. But against this grossness, the novella balances the papers, which are invested through their proximity to the hand and eye of the poet, with an aesthetic purity that is associated not with the gross, but with the mere, the term that James opposes to the gross throughout his fiction. And we could talk about this. The mere and the gross are one of those pairs in James's vocabulary that recur right across the oeuvre. In the primal scene of the novel, the critic finds himself finally within touching distance of these elusive papers. The older Miss Bordereau, as he believes, is on her deathbed in that interior room that we saw earlier. He has let himself through an outer room of the palazzo and into the old lady's inner chamber, where there is a writing desk in which he thinks the papers are secreted. She is dying in the other room. He thinks, I'm just going to nab those papers. His desire for the papers has made him gross enough to seduce an older woman in whom he has no sexual interest, and to sneak into the chamber of an even older woman who's lying on her deathbed in order, perhaps, to steal her most prized possession. The desk opened with a key, but there was a little brass handle like a button as well, the critic says. It suddenly comes to him that the younger Miss Bordereau, out of love for him, has unlocked the desk, so the double price he has paid of extortionate rent on the one hand and falsely requited love on the other has brought him close to the treasure. The lid would probably move, he thinks, if I touched the button. I touch the button with my hand, he says, as the tension ratchets up and up. A mere touch would tell me. The critic here is a mere touch away from the region that the papers make available to thought, the space of unwritten aesthetic beauty that lies at the heart of all of those reader-writer stories. I hope it's not a spoiler for me to inform you that he's prevented in his quest by a furious older Miss Bordereau who suddenly manages to come off her deathbed and catch him in the act. The gross world of finance and sexual impropriety promises to yield through the critic's mere touch to the uncontaminated world of pure poetry. But what makes the approach to the writer-reader space James stakes out here unusual in his oeuvre is that it's mapped on to those writer-painter spaces that James conjures in that other body of work, Glass is the Real Thing, elsewhere. Juliana Bordereau won't allow the critic the merest glimpse of the papers, but she does offer him, at the eye-watering cost of £1,000, which is a tremendous amount of money at the time, a miniature portrait of the great poet. During one of their early interviews, Miss Bordereau, in a fantastically described scene, drew out of her pocket with an embarrassed hand a small object wrapped in crumpled white paper. She unfolded the white paper and made a motion for me to take from her a small oval portrait. I possessed myself of it with a hand of which I could only hope she did not perceive the tremor, and she added, I would part for it only for a good price. The portrait is a careful but not a supreme work of art, larger than the ordinary miniature and representing a young man with a remarkably handsome face, the face of Geoffrey Aspern at 25. From this moment on, the portrait of Aspern is balanced against his other kinds of presence in the story, the echo of Aspern that the critic finds in Juliana's eyes, the voice of Aspern as he imagines would be secreted in the lost papers. And then as the story draws to a close, the younger Miss Bordereau offers the portrait to the critic as a gift after the old lady's eventual death, as another inducement to marriage, along with the final prize of the papers. So he's really close now. Miss Tita takes the portrait out of her pocket, wrapped in the same manner as her aunt had wrapped it, and presents it to the critic as this gift with strings attached. I looked at Geoffrey Aspern's face in the little picture, partly in order not to look at that of my interlocutress, which had begun to trouble me, even to frighten me a little. It was so self-conscious, so unnatural. I privately consulted Geoffrey Aspern's delightful eyes with my own. They were so young and brilliant and yet so wise, so full of vision. I bent my head over Geoffrey Aspern's portrait, he says, as he considers Miss Tita's offer of marriage, as if Aspern himself can guide him, can help him decide with the mere look in his eye, whether to purchase these papers and this portrait that he's looking at with a dishonest marriage. And it is as if Aspern speaks to him, or the portrait of Aspern speaks to him, like something out of a Gothic tale, to tell him what he should do. What an odd expression was in his face. Get out of it as soon as you can, my dear fellow, is what Aspern in the portrait says. This is a dizzying moment in James's novella. The nameless critic stands before the portrait of Aspern, asking his advice on the ethics of marrying against all erotic and emotional inclination for the sake of this proximity to Aspern's art. And as he does so, we find ourselves as readers standing on that ground that lies at the heart of The Wings of the Dove, as Millie stands before the Bronzino, the ontological ground that comes out of hiding in all these writer, reader, writer, artist novellas and stories. The critic's approach to the portrait of Aspern harmonizes with and amplifies his approach to the painter, to the papers, as the story's picturing of Venice and of the two old ladies, these after effects of the vision with which Aspern's painted eyes are so full, swirls around Aspern as around a kind of origin. Briefly, this spell, the magic of Aspern's gaze, has the odd effect, and it's one of the strangest moments in the story, the odd effect of transfiguring Miss Tita, as if poetry might remake life, might restore a kind of fullness to the dilapidated afterlife that the story has presented us with in Venice throughout. The critic flees from the palazzo when Miss Tita makes her offer, the papers and the portrait in return for his hand. It's too much for him, he can't take it. He thinks, I'm just going to go. And he's ashamed and appalled with himself for even thinking about it. But after a few hours of dazed reflection, as you can imagine, wandering around the city, in fact, going around on a boat, he finds that the offer itself, art in return for life, has transformed Miss Tita, and he feels ready, eager even to enter into the union. He returns to the palazzo to find her standing in the middle of the room, and her look of forgiveness and absolution made her angelic. It beautified her. She was younger. She was not a ridiculous old woman. This optical trick gave her a sort of phantasmagoric brightness. And while I was still the victim of it, I heard a whisper somewhere in the depths of my conscience. Why not, after all? Why not? It seemed to me I was ready to pay the price. Is ready to pay the price. Proximity to the papers, to art in its purest, most withheld form, outweighs gross concerns. Indeed, it transmogrifies the gross distortions of capital into the mereness of an uninstantiated art. But, and perhaps you've guessed this, the critic learns to his intense horror, just as he's decided to pay the price after his little reflection in Venice, that Miss Tita, fearing that the critic will refuse her, has destroyed the papers. I burned them last night, she says, one by one in the kitchen. It took a long time. There were so many. That's a terrible line. The room seemed to go round, the critic said, and a real darkness for a moment descended on my eyes. When he can see again, he finds that the transfiguration was over and Miss Tita had changed back to a plain, dingy, elderly person. Final section. It's perhaps difficult not to read this ending as an assertion of the gross over the mere, a sense that the hidden, fragile work of poetry cannot come into any meaningful contact with the real world of crude motivations, of profit and loss and abuse. The critic finds the money to buy that extortionately expensive portrait of Aspern, and he tells us in the closing line of the story that the portrait hangs over my writing table. When I look at it, my chagrin at the loss of the papers becomes almost intolerable. And that painting hanging over the writing table is perhaps a sign of the intermedial. This ending appears to forsake the love of beauty for a chagrined disaffection. If you're reading this novella for an affirmation of the transformative power of art, it seems to say, then you're going to be disappointed. There is no figure in the carpet. There is no secret lying behind the facade of the artwork or secreted in the secretary. The gross currency in which the story deals, the swollen funds which the critic lavishes on his search for the papers, his callous trading of a lonely woman's infatuation for access to Aspern's art, this gross currency is not going to be redeemed. This may be the case, but if this story, and by extension the ground that James fashions in his intermedial works more generally, has anything to say to the questions with which I began this lecture, then it does so because even as it marks out the failure of the relation between artwork and world, it also itself becomes a form of relation, one forged in the closest possible attention to the incompatibilities between art and life that sustain it. This simultaneous failure and restitution of relation is what determines the politics of James's aesthetics and his thinking more generally about the value of beauty. Some such difficult combination of the simultaneous failure and restitution of relation is perhaps at work in all of the James stories that I've discussed here. The Aspern Papers traces the way that the critic's love of Aspern's beauty cannot survive the grossness which that love spawns in him. The mistreatment of Miss Tita, perhaps you can hear mistreatment in her name, is what happens when a mere ideal comes into contact with a gross reality. But even as these stories measure out this gulf between artwork and world, it's their central vocation to find in the ground that opens up between them a kind of relation that does not simply fail when art and world, when the inside and the outside of the lecture hall reveal their mutual refusal of each other. Rather than dramatizing the falling away of these terms or spaces from each other, these stories dwell in the particular terrain that is summoned by their coexistence in order to produce right there before us, palpably, tangibly, not as an abstract idea, but as a reality that we can see, the terms in which an aesthetic judgment might give rise to a common sense, a sensus communae, and so to lay out the conditions in which a love of beauty might produce the possibility of a shared world. If our relation to beauty and to the very possibility of aesthetic education now requires us, in Barber's terms, to stand before, then this is the ground on which such standing before might become possible. It's in the closeted scenes that recur throughout these stories, as writer stands before reader, as character stands before artwork, that this ground can be most clearly seen. In the Aspern Papers, these scenes take place in the inside rooms, the hidden, closeted inside rooms of that Venetian palazzo, the inner chamber, which is also a mere sanctum of the artwork. As the critic stands before Juliana Bordereau, he stands before an elderly lady who is at the same time not only the young version of herself who inspired Aspern's verse, but also the only living extension of the poet himself. On first approaching her in this inner retreat, the critic says that, quote, "My heart beat fast." I think it's there. "My heart beat fast." My heart beat fast as if the miracle of resurrection had taken place for my benefit. Her presence, he says, seemed somehow to contain his. And as she presses in that same inner room the little oval portrait of the poet into the critic's hands, the narrative puts these versions, these manifestations of artist and artwork into the kind of motion that is the signature effect of James's fiction. To be in the presence of Miss Bordereau, the critic thinks, is to be in the presence of Aspern's art. I felt a mystic companionship, he thinks, a moral fraternity with all those who in the past had been in the service of art. They had worked for beauty, for a devotion, and what else was I doing? That element was in everything that Jeffrey Aspern had written, and I was only bringing it into the light. This is, of course, deluded and wrong-headed and insulting. I mean, he's simply exploiting an older woman for his own private pleasure. But as the critic and Miss Bordereau talk, as their conversation turns around this junction between the mere artwork and its gross extensions into the world, the story touches on the place where art and life meet, the place that is named both in its appearance and its failure to appear in the title of the novella itself. The Aspern Papers might never materialize, but they take on a kind of existence in the Aspern Papers, the artwork that we hold before us, and that is, in fact, the Aspern Papers, just as the figure in the carpet is both there and not there, missing but enshrined in the title of the work that we are reading. The figure in the carpet is the figure in the carpet. These works are what they are about, and there's a whole genre of works that are what they are about. And as the critic and Miss Bordereau discuss the possibility of bearing witness to the artwork, it's this double being that comes to the surface of the page. Miss Bordereau insists on the absence of the artwork, its retreat from the critic's grasp, just as Verica in The Figure in the Carpet insists that the secret of his art has escaped the language and the perceptual grasp of any critic. Do you think it's right to rake up the past? Juliana asks, preserving that past that she shares with Aspern from the critic's view. That's her job, is to hide it, to keep it hidden. I like the past, she says, but I don't like critics. The truth of the artwork, she said, is God's, it isn't man's. We had better leave it alone. Who can judge it? Who can say? What sensus communae could gather these papers into its remit? Miss Bordereau refuses the commons of aesthetic judgment, but it is the work of the Aspern Papers and of James's art more generally to preserve that refusal as the very medium of judgment, to make artworks that bear witness to the non-relation that is beauty, while bringing that non-relation into a contingent kind of relation. I'm a critic, a historian, the critic explains to Juliana. It's his job, he says, to speak for those better ones than myself, the great writers mainly, the great philosophers and poets of the past, those who are dead and gone and can't speak for themselves. Speaking for themselves is a strange phrase. To approach this place where the artwork speaks in a language that does not belong to it is to commit a double offense. It drags the artwork out of its sanctum and into a light in which it can only be misrecognized. And it draws those of us who would stand before the work of art into that darkness in which we lose our way, in which our judgments are cast into the abyss of non-being, where Dasein, in Heidegger's terms, stands before itself. We are terribly in the dark, I know, the critic says to Juliana in one of his only truthful statements to her. As the novelist Denkham famously says on his deathbed to his critic and reader, Dr. Hugh, in the Middle Years, another of these stories, we work in the dark, we do what we can, we give what we have. To approach the artwork is to commit ourselves to darkness, the real darkness into which the critic is plunged when he learns that the Aspern Papers have been burned. But James has a word for this experience of lit darkness, this experience of non-relation in the midst of relation that is the precondition for aesthetic experience. He calls it living. The figure in the carpet remains unseen in the figure in the carpet, but it is the basis for this kind of Jamesian living. The novelist Gwendolen Erme, she's one of the many people in his oeuvre whose name anagramizes the mere. The novelist Gwendolen Erme learns Vereker's secret and puts it to a kind of use, that word use again. She used it herself, the critic protagonist says. She told me with her own lips that she lived on it. The Aspern Papers remain unseen in the Aspern Papers, but as Miss Tita tells the critic, they too are used, as Miss Bordereau, like Gwendolen Erme, lived on them. It's the task of these works to make art live, to make art the basis of a kind of living that is an amalgam of the gross and the mere, the fictional and the real, being and non-being. The artwork, as Denkham puts it in the Middle Years, is the unwritten, the unalloyed, the lost. To approach the artwork is to approach this non-being, but it's the task of aesthetic judgment and of aesthetic education to make a ground out of this meeting, of non-being with being. It's not that we have to choose between standing in the lecture hall or standing on the street. James's intermedial fictions educate us in the requirement that we stand on that ground where non-being as a possibility meets with the languages and apparatuses of being, and we make of that meeting the very condition of living. Beauty is perhaps inimical to life. The beautiful child in James's exquisite story, The Author of Beltraffio, is, as the narrator of that tale puts it, too beautiful to live. The child in that story is an artwork in his own right, a living picture, and his inevitable death is a mark of the artwork's affinity with non-being. But it is nevertheless the task of the Author of Beltraffio to make that child live, to bring the child's frail beauty to life at the risk of misrecognizing both beauty and life. This misrecognition is the failure of the artwork. It is what makes it so difficult to cross that line between art and life, a line or threshold which maims all those who cross it from either side. But it's also what art is, what aesthetic judgment is, a misrecognition that is the basis for all aesthetic education and the ground on which we have to learn, like weak-limbed infants, to stand every day anew and as if for the first time. I'll leave it.
Fascinating